start of the Viking Age, or Werewolvas, the slaughter wolves in Old English, was the coming together of many elements: demographic, social, political, ideological, which once set in motion became an unstoppable force. Actually, the violence beyond Scandinavia was in many ways an export of the trends happening inside Scandinavia, with incessant fights among petty kings who started to look for opportunities elsewhere. Do the written sources tell us enough about the beginnings? Well, more or less. Here the terrible portents came about over the land of Northumbria and miserably frightened the people. These were immense flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. A great famine immediately followed these signs, and little after that, in the same year, on June the 8th, the raiding of heathen men miserably devastated God's church in Lindisfarne Island by looting and slaughter. This is the entry from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for 793. A horrible attack that scared everyone out of their wits. The Vikings' attack on the monastery of St. Cuthbert on the holy island of Lindisfarne off the northern coast of Northumbria marks the earliest recorded and best known of the Viking raids. One of the most holy sites in Anglo-Saxon England, it had been founded in 633 by Aidan, an Irish monk summoned by King Oswald to be the first bishop of Bernicia, the northern part of his kingdom. Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain, as we now suffered from a pagan race, nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert, spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments, a place more venerable than all of England, is given as a prey to pagan peoples. This is what we find written by Alcuin in a letter to Ethelred, king of Northumbria. Another chronicler, also working from a lost version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, but writing in the 12th century, Simon of Durham, tells of that fateful year. In the same year, the pagans from the northern regions came with a naval force to Britain like stinging hornets and spread on all sides like fearful wolves, robbed, tore and slaughtered not only beasts of burden, sheep and oxen, but even priests and deacons and companies of monks and nuns. And they came to the church of Lindisfarne, laid everything waste with grievous plundering, trampled the holy places with polluted steps, dug up the altars and seized all the treasures in the holy church. They killed some of the brothers, took some away with them in fetters, many they drove out, naked and loaded with insults, some they drowned in the sea. However, there is an even earlier reference which is pretty hard to place. Let me tell you what it is about. Here, Bethric, he was the king of Wessex between 786 and 802, took King Offa's daughter Edba, and in his days there came for the first time 3 ships, and then the reeve rode there and wanted to compel them to go to the king's town, because he did not know what they were, and they killed him. Those were the first ships of the Danish men, which sought out the land of the English race. A version of the manuscript does not mention their origin, and there are other versions calling them Northmen, people from Hordaland, and these terms get really mixed up, and we shouldn't really rely on them to draw any conclusions about the exact origins of these peoples. Most likely they were bands with members from all around Scandinavia. So when you see the name Danish, it doesn't automatically mean that they came from what is known today as Denmark. This was the entry for the year 789, written by the chronicler 100 years later. Almost 2 centuries later still, Ethelred, a descendant of King Alfred's brother Ethelred and ealdorman of Wessex, wrote his own chronicle, a Latin translation of a lost version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that elaborates on the momentous event. Now, does this automatically mean Vikings attacked earlier? Well, yes and no. The timeline of the reign of King Bethric and the raids in the north seem unclear, and the thing is that the authors of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle had their own worries about the Viking wars during the reign of Alfred the Great. So it would be imaginable that the authors wanted to emphasize the involvement of West Saxons in the Viking story. At any rate, according to the sources, the highest impact can still be linked to Lindisfarne, although Vikings were indeed known in these territories earlier on. But this is where things get much more interesting. Now, before I go on to explain why, do me a huge favor and subscribe if you want access to scholarly, actual historical content on the Norse world, and give me a hand in growing this channel. So, the thing is that the Norse may actually have started their overseas activities in the east and not in the west. At least this is what the latest archaeological research suggests. The written sources are more or less limited on this account. I'm referring here to 2 remarkable ships retrieved from Estonia, which are a compelling indication that the Viking Age was already in the making before the attack on Lindisfarne. The 2 boats discovered contained the remains of dozens of men. 7 lay in the smaller of the 2 boats. In the larger vessel, we have 33 men who were buried in a neat pile, stacked together with their weapons and animals. The site seems to have been arranged as a mass grave, the final resting place for Scandinavian warriors killed in an ill-fated raid on Saaremaa, that's an island off the coast of Estonia. Archaeologists believe the men died in a battle sometime between 700 and 750. Archaeologists first pieced together the remains of the 7 men on the first ship, all between the ages of 18 and 45. They also found knives, whetstones, a bone comb, and even carved bone gaming pieces. By measuring the position of the more than 1,200 nails and rivets from the second ship and carefully looking at the soil where the wood had rotted, it was concluded that Salme 2, so the boats were named after the village on this island, was about 17 meters long and 3 meters wide. The craft had a keel, an element critical to keeping a sailing ship upright in the water. Clusters of iron and wood near the center of the boat and pieces of cloth recovered from the soil may be indications of a mast and a sail. The Salme 2 vessel was certainly capable of crossing the open sea, so the technology, which was one of the factors enabling the Viking Age, was already in the making. Salme 2 may very well be the oldest sailing vessel ever found in the Baltic. Essentially, all archaeologists who had a look at this ship concluded it is a ship where a sail would have made a lot of sense. So, a Viking ship. The mystery continues with how these Scandinavians ended up like this. Well, what could have happened is that on this remote beach, a powerful raiding group encountered a tough adversary after being drawn overseas by loot with the intention of maybe collecting tribute from the residents or settling a grudge. Following a struggle, the survivors of one side, it's actually unclear which side emerged victorious, gathered the dead and ceremoniously destroyed the fallen friends' swords by burning, bending or shattering them. The soldiers who were still alive had enough time to haul at least 2 of their ships up the gently sloping beach. Then they buried inside the 33 soldiers of Salme 2, men of fighting age, all robust and healthy. There was clear care and consideration in doing it. Like a blanket, shields were placed over the skeletons, and from among the bones there were also found fragments of textile, maybe the pieces of the sail that had been used as a shroud to conceal the dead before sand was added. The Salme ship graves are unique, even though boat funerals are known from literary sagas and archaeological discoveries in England, Sweden and Norway. Boat tombs were almost invariably solitary operations, nevertheless, where a king or lord was interred behind a substantial mound of earth that encased the whole boat. And this Far East has never produced any boat tombs, as a matter of fact. So that's a link that ties the Vendel period, the pre-Viking Age, to the Vikings, and the evidence is provided by the Salme boats, suggesting that these later customs most likely developed over centuries. While there are elements of boat burials, archaeologists notice it was done in a hurry, so bodies were covered with sand in a mass grave. This is extraordinary regardless for pointing out the evolution towards the Viking Age, especially since we don't really have any physical evidence of warfare and raiding. The find shows that the idea of Vikings just popping out of nowhere and starting raiding needs serious revisions. It is evident from the remnants that Scandinavian princes were planning war expeditions decades or even longer before the disaster laid upon Lindisfarne in 793. Even though the Salme sailing party's members were buried collectively, a wealthy warlord or chieftain and a few well-prepared lieutenants led a band of warriors as depicted by the weaponry. On Salme 2, for example, we have 5 men with double-edged swords and elaborately decorated hilts buried on top, which was a clear sign of status. Since 2012, when the excavation was finished, forensic anthropologists have been trying to find out why these people died, and there are actually plenty of reasons to think they died in battle, as mentioned before, because we have chop marks on a humerus, for example, and also a skull that's been cut right through. As a matter of fact, few bodies have clear cuts on the bones, to be frank. Nonetheless, there are many ways to die without something leaving a mark on your bones. Some bones have signs of old wounds, indicating experienced raiders in the crew as well. And while the grave was rushed, they did make some arrangements, like someone with a severed arm arranged with his limbs properly. so that's important. It's difficult to say whom they were fighting against. There is a much later reference from the 13th century to a nobleman named Ingvar who perished in Estonia in the 600s, yet there is really no way to tell for sure. He is said to have been buried in the Adalsisla district right opposite to the island of Saaremaa. The Austmar, the Eastern Sea in Old Norse, was nevertheless a key arena for maritime power. Here both archaeology and literature concur. The operations of the semi-mythical Ynglinga dynasty, for example, mentioned by Snorri Sturluson, were around here. The location is also quite bizarre because we don't really have any high-value targets in this area of Estonia. So, looting a village maybe? However, the grave goods were left intact, so maybe the place was abandoned afterwards? Well, more likely, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of the people investigating it as well, there was a battle between two rival groups, probably started out at sea and continued on this beach. With a vast majority in their 30s from the region of the Mälar Valley in Sweden, most with the same family background according to the DNA analysis. So, in the very exact sense of the term, raiding actually started in the east, in the more domestic area, so to speak. On the other hand, the idea of launching long-distance expeditions beyond the Nordic comfort zone is indeed directed towards the British Isles first. Ireland was assaulted in 795 with monasteries like Iona and Inishmurray. In 808, the Royal Frankish Annals mention how pirates captured a papal envoy for money. In southern England, Kentish charters mention fortifications against the pagans. So the Age of Vikings was starting to bloom, but please take into consideration the fact that the raiding itself, in its original sense, might have actually started in the east, not west, at least according to archaeological sources, which is pretty fascinating. If you want to know more about these people and their beliefs, check out my video about how they organized themselves in Iceland, for example. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and until next time.